My name is Olya. I am the first child in this family. Since I was young, I got used to waking up earlier than everyone else. Not because I was diligent, but because there was always something I needed to help with. Sweeping the floor, preparing breakfast, making sure my younger sibling was ready for school. My mother often said I was dependable. My father said I grew up too fast. I took those words as compliments, even though I never really thought about them deeply. My birthday always falls on the same date as my siblings. Our age difference is only a few years, and since we were little, my parents felt it was more practical to celebrate just one special day. They said it saved time and energy. But at some point, the celebration stopped feeling like it belonged to both of us. It felt like it belonged only to my sibling. I still remember the first birthday when I realized something was different. That day, the house was filled with colorful balloons. The table was packed with food. Music played loudly. Neighbors came bringing gifts. Everyone smiled and hugged my sibling. Their name was called over and over again. I helped welcome guests, poured drinks, and cleared dirty plates. Nothing seemed wrong at the time. I was the older sibling, so that was my role, or so I thought. When the cake was brought out, my sibling's name was clearly written on top. The candles were lit. Everyone sang. I clapped along. In the middle of the song, I quietly hoped my name would be mentioned too, even just once. But the song ended, the candles were blown out, and everyone laughed again. No one noticed that small hope I had just held. From that day on, the pattern never changed. Every year there was always a party. There was always plenty of food. The gifts always piled up, but everything was focused on one person. I was never completely forgotten. My name was still part of the family. I was still invited to eat together. I was still given tasks to help, but I was never celebrated. My parents are not bad people. They work hard. They made sure we received a good education. They were there when I was sick. They supported my choices in many ways. There was just one thing they always missed, and strangely, it happened again and again without ever being discussed. Whenever someone asked, "When is your birthday?" my mother would quickly answer, "On the same day as the younger one." The answer sounded simple, but for some reason it always made me feel like an extra, not the center. I learned not to ask. I learned not to wait. I learned to treat that day like any other day. I went to school, came home, had dinner, and went to sleep. There was no special cake, no greeting, no small surprise. I convinced myself that it did not matter. But my body and my thoughts often said otherwise. Every time I saw photos of my siblings' birthday party displayed in the living room, a small part of me seemed to shrink. Not because of jealousy, but because I felt unseen. I once tried to give a hint. One time I said softly, "Tomorrow is my birthday too." My mother nodded while still looking at her phone. My father smiled and said, "Yes, it will be celebrated together." The word later always sounded unfinished and eventually disappeared. I never hated my sibling. They grew up surrounded by attention, and that was not their fault. They never asked for big parties. They simply accepted what was given. Sometimes they asked why I never asked for anything. I answered with a small smile, saying that I did not need anything. But the truth was, I needed one simple thing. I wanted to be remembered, not as the older sibling who always helps. Not as the child who never causes trouble, but as myself. Without realizing it, that habit grew with me year after year until it became part of my life and felt normal, even though it never truly was. My birthday always comes the same way. From early morning, the house is already busy. My mother moves back and forth from the kitchen to the living room. My father is busy answering calls from relatives who are confirming their arrival times. My sibling looks the most relaxed. They know the day is about them. They are used to being the center of attention. I wake up early without being asked. I go straight to the kitchen and help my mother prepare the food. There is no special good morning greeting, nothing different from an ordinary day. There are no words that mark the day as special for me. I do not wait for anything. I simply do what I always do. On the kitchen table, the menu list is neatly written. There is more food than usual. My mother asks me to chop vegetables and prepare drinks. I nod and start working. My hands move automatically. My mind is not fully there, but I stay focused so I do not make mistakes. As noon approaches, guests begin to arrive. Some cousins come carrying large gift boxes. They immediately look for my sibling. Their name is called out loudly. They smile and respond with excitement. I greet the guests, help place the gifts, then return to the kitchen. No one asks how I am. No one mentions that the day also means something to me. I stand near the living room door for a moment, observing the scene. Balloons are neatly hung. A birthday banner is clearly displayed. My sibling's name is printed in large letters at the center. I write it quietly in my head, then look away. I do not feel angry. I simply feel out of place. When the food is served, I help carry the plates to the table. Some people praise my mother's cooking. Others joke about how lucky my sibling is. I smile briefly, then go back to the kitchen to get drinks. My role is clear, and I perform it without much thought. When the cake is brought out, everyone gathers. Music plays. Candles are lit. The birthday song is sung with enthusiasm. I stand at the back and clap along. I look at my sibling's glowing face. All eyes are on them. There is no space for anyone else. After the candles are blown out and the applause fades, I help cut the cake. My mother hands me the knife without saying anything. I cut carefully, making sure each slice is neat. I deliver each plate to the guests. Some people say thank you. I respond briefly, then move away. I do not expect a cake with my name on it. I do not wait for the song to be sung again. I just want one person to look at me and say, "Happy birthday to you too." The sentence is simple, but it never comes. In the afternoon, the atmosphere becomes calmer. Children play outside. Adults sit and chat. Gifts are opened one by one. My sibling laughs, trying out new items. My father captures the moments with a camera. My mother smiles with satisfaction. I clear dirty plates and carry them to the kitchen. In the kitchen, I stand still for a moment and take a deep breath. I look at my hands, sticky with leftover cake cream. I wash them slowly. The water runs, and the noise from the living room is still audible. I feel like I am in a different world, even though it is only a few steps away. I have thought about speaking up. I have imagined approaching my mother and telling her that I want to be celebrated too. But every time that thought appears, another voice in my head says it is unnecessary. I do not want to change the mood. I do not want to be seen as too much. I choose to stay silent, as always. At night, after the guests leave, the house becomes quiet again. Balloons are still hanging. Wrapping paper is scattered around. My sibling looks tired but happy. They show me their last gift. I nod and say it is nice. They smile and go to their room. I clean the living room with my mother. There's no important conversation. We focus on tidying up the house. When everything is done, I go to my room. I sit on the edge of the bed and stare at the empty wall. The day ends without any marker for me. Before sleeping, I check my phone. A few friends have sent short messages. They wish me a happy birthday. I reply with thank you. Those messages warm my chest a little, but they also remind me that in my own home, my birthday still goes unmentioned. The day passes like the years before. A party for my sibling, silence for me. I turn off the light and lie down. I tell myself that I am fine. I am used to it. But deep inside, there is a small part of me that keeps asking how long I have to pretend that I do not care. After several years passed with the same pattern, I began to build my own way of surviving. I stopped marking my birthday on the calendar. I no longer counted the days. For me, the less I remembered, the smaller the chance of being disappointed. That method was not perfect, but it helped me get through my days without asking too many questions. I consciously lowered my expectations. Whenever a small desire appeared, I quickly pushed it down. I told myself that attention was not something that needed to be asked for. If it existed, it would come on its own. If it did not, then it was not something I needed to wait for. That way of thinking sounded reasonable, even though it was really just my way of protecting myself. At home, my role became even clearer. I was the one most often asked to help. If my mother was tired, I stepped in. If my father came home late, I made sure everything was taken care of. No one forced me, but I knew they relied on me. I wanted to be the child who did not cause trouble. I wanted the house to stay calm. Outside the house, I seemed fine. At school, I was active and responsible. Teachers trusted me. Friends saw me as independent. Not many people knew that whenever the topic of birthdays came up, I always chose to stay quiet or smile briefly. I never shared my own story. I once tried to convince myself that not everyone needed to be celebrated. Some people were meant to be supporters, not the center. I placed myself in that group. By thinking that way, I felt stronger. I felt mature. At least, that was how I appeared to others. However, there were small moments that cracked that defense. Seeing birthday posts from friends on social media. Hearing simple stories about small surprises from other people's families. I was not jealous, but I felt distant. As if there was a common experience that I had never had. I also began to compare things without meaning to. Not about gifts or parties, but about reactions. Whenever my sibling made a mistake, my parents were quick to forgive. When I did the same, they expected me to understand better. They said I was more mature. That word was often used, but rarely explained. I accepted it without protest. Over time, I realized that I had become used to giving in even before being asked. I held back my opinions to avoid conflict. I chose silence when something made me uncomfortable. I learned to read the situation quickly and adjust myself. I did all of that so I would not add to anyone's burden. I never talked openly about my feelings. Not because I did not trust my family, but because I was afraid of being seen as too much. I was afraid that if I spoke up, the response would only be excuses. I did not want to hear explanations anymore. It felt safer to keep everything to myself. One afternoon, my mother asked why I rarely asked for anything. She said I always seemed satisfied with what I had. I smiled and replied that I truly did not need much. That answer relieved her. She did not know that I was simply tired of hoping. In my room, I often sat alone thinking about small things, not big plans, just simple questions. Whether I really was not that important, whether the first was too quiet and easy to overlook. I never found answers to those questions. I continued living my days as usual. Waking up early, leaving the house, coming home, helping out, then sleeping. That routine made life feel safe. There were no surprises, but there were no major disappointments either. I saw it as a balance I could accept. Yet the more I tried to accept it, the clearer the feeling became. It never truly went away. There was an empty space that could not be filled by achievements or praise. That space appeared every time I felt unseen. I covered it with busyness, but it remained. I began to ask myself whether silence always meant strength. Whether accepting everything without speaking was always the right choice. Those questions did not change anything right away, but they stayed with me. They settled quietly in my thoughts, waiting for the right moment. I was not ready to do anything yet. I still chose silence. But for the first time, I stopped blaming myself for feeling this way. I began to acknowledge that what I felt was real. Not excessive, not wrong. Just never given space. As I grew older, I began to notice patterns that I once thought were just coincidences. Not because of one major event, but because of many small things that kept repeating. Every time I looked back on the past, the same thread always appeared. Attention at home was never shared evenly, even though it was never stated openly. My father and mother often said they loved us in the same way. The sentence sounded fair, and they probably believed it themselves. But in daily life, their behavior shows something different. My sibling was asked how they were more often. Their opinions were listened to more frequently. Their mistakes were forgiven more quickly. None of it came from bad intentions, but the impact was still there. I did not immediately recognize it as favoritism. At first, I thought my siblings simply needed more attention. They were more careless, more emotional, more likely to cause small problems. I was calmer and seen as capable of taking care of myself. That logic made sense, at least on the surface. Over time, however, that explanation was no longer enough. I began to notice details that could not be explained by busyness or personality. When I came home late because of school activities, no one asked if I was tired. When my sibling came home looking upset, the entire house became more alert. The contrast was too strong to ignore. I also started to notice how my parents talked about us to other people. When they spoke about my sibling, they often sounded proud. When they spoke about me, they usually said I did not ask for much. The sentence sounded positive, but behind it was a heavy expectation. As if my calmness was an obligation, not a choice. At the dinner table, conversations often revolved around my siblings' activities, their achievements, their plans, their complaints. If I tried to speak, the discussion quickly shifted back. No one deliberately interrupted me, but I was rarely given the space to finish my sentences. Eventually, I learned to keep my stories to myself. I once tried to address it in a gentle way. One evening, I asked why my birthday was never celebrated on its own. My mother replied that it was not important because we were still together as a family. My father added that I had never seemed to mind. That response closed the conversation before it could go any further. From that moment, I understood one thing. As long as I stayed silent, everything would be seen as fine. My silence was interpreted as agreement. My lack of complaint became justification. I felt trapped in a role I never chose, but had carried for far too long. I do not hate my parents. I know they did what they believed was best. They simply did not realize that uneven attention can be just as painful as neglect. They did not see the wound because I never showed it. My relationship with my sibling was also affected, even though I never talked about it. A small distance slowly grew. Not out of jealousy but out of exhaustion. I often felt the need to give in so the atmosphere would stay peaceful. I did not want them to feel guilty over something that was not their fault. Inside me, there was a conflict that kept circling. I wanted to be understood, but I also wanted to keep the peace. I wanted to be remembered, but I was afraid that asking for it would make me seem selfish. I weighed too many things before speaking, and in the end, I chose to close my mouth again. The favoritism was never acknowledged, but it was always felt. It appeared in small decisions, in priorities, in tone of voice. It did not shout, but it was consistent. And that consistency was what made it impossible to deny. I began to ask myself whether it was normal to feel this way. I often compared my family to others, looking for validation. Part of me said I was being too sensitive. Another part said my feelings were valid. That inner conflict was exhausting because there was no answer that truly brought peace. Even so, I continued living my days as usual. I did not change my behavior. I kept helping. I kept smiling. I kept showing up at every family gathering. From the outside, nothing looked different. But inside, I started to take notes. I became aware. I stopped denying what I had been feeling all along. That awareness did not immediately give me courage, but it changed the way I saw the situation. I no longer blamed myself for the attention that never came. I began to understand that the problem was not that I mattered less, but that I had been seen as capable of carrying everything on my own for too long. As my birthday approached this year, something felt different weeks beforehand. It was not a major event, just a feeling that was hard to explain. I continued with the same routine, waking up early, helping at home, and going about my activities as usual. From the outside, nothing had changed. But in my head, a restlessness appeared without a clear reason. I became more sensitive to conversations at home. Whenever my parents discussed plans, I listened more carefully than before. When my mother mentioned a date, I immediately understood what it meant. That date would once again be used to celebrate my sibling. Like every other year, there was no pause and no alternative discussion. Everything flowed in one direction. Normally, I would have ignored something like that. I would have told myself that I was already used to it. This time, that sentence did not work. There was a tiredness I could not push away. Not anger, and not an overwhelming sadness either. It felt more like being exhausted from holding the same thing in for too long. I tried to understand where that feeling was coming from. I asked myself whether I was expecting more. The answer was not simple. I was not imagining a party. I did not want expensive gifts. I just wanted one small acknowledgement. I wanted the day to not pass by completely unnoticed. A few days before the date arrived, I saw my mother writing a shopping list on a small piece of paper. It was long: food, drinks, decorations. I stood nearby, watching without saying anything. She asked for my opinion about the menu. I gave short answers and helped as best as I could. My hands and my mouth worked as usual, but my mind was not fully present. That night I sat alone in my room. I tried to do something I rarely did, stopping for a moment without distractions. No phone, no music, just me and my own thoughts. For the first time in a long while, I honestly asked myself whether I was truly fine. The answer came quietly but clearly. I was okay, but I was not whole. There was a part of me that was always left behind every time that day came and went without meaning. That realization did not make me cry. Instead, it made me calm because I finally stopped denying it. I began to think about other possibilities, not about confronting my parents or asking for explanations. I knew that conversation would not be easy, and I was not ready. What I thought about was what I could do for myself, how I could stop feeling like a spectator in my own life. I realized that I had been waiting too much from other people, waiting to be noticed, remembered, treated equally. That waiting had made me passive. I kept hoping something would change on its own. This year, that thought no longer felt enough. I did not make a decision right away. I let the idea grow. I started to imagine my birthday without the family party. I imagined being somewhere else, doing something simple that made me feel calm. The image felt unfamiliar, but also relieving. The following days passed quickly. Party preparations became more intense. The house grew busier. My sibling looked excited. I continued to help as usual. No one suspected anything. No one asked if I was looking forward to the day. I did not give any signs either. In the middle of all that activity, I felt a small distance forming between me and the house. Not a physical distance, but an emotional one. I began to protect my feelings in a different way. I stopped hoping. I started preparing myself to live that day by my own choice. I also realized that the exhaustion I felt was not only about my birthday. It was the accumulation of years before it, of constantly giving in, of carrying a role that was never reviewed. That awareness made my thoughts clearer. I did not want to keep living the same pattern. One afternoon, my mother asked if I was okay. She said I seemed quieter than usual. I smiled and replied that I was just a little tired. That answer was not completely false. I was tired, just not physically. She nodded and did not ask further. On the night before my birthday, I sat in my room again. This time my thoughts were more organized. I knew that tomorrow would not be different if I kept doing the same things. That realization did not scare me. Instead, it gave me a small sense of control that I had never felt before. I did not know how the day would end. I did not prepare a big plan. I only knew one thing. This year, I did not want to disappear again on a day that was supposed to be mine too. The decision was not fully formed yet, but the intention was already there. That morning, the house felt busier than usual. Before the sun had fully risen, the sound of footsteps was already echoing from different corners. My mother opened and closed cabinets. My father went in and out of the yard. and my sibling paced back and forth while holding a phone. Everyone was moving with the same purpose. Once again, the day was a big one for them. I woke up and sat on the edge of my bed for a moment. I was not in a hurry like I usually was. There was a strange calm with me. I already knew what would happen throughout the day, and because of that I did not feel surprised. I stood up, made my bed, and left my room. In the kitchen, my mother had already started cooking. Her face was focused, her hands moving quickly. She glanced at me briefly and asked for help preparing the ingredients. I nodded and took the cutting board. There was no other conversation. No words that marked the day as important for me as well. I accepted that without reaction. While chopping the food, I paid attention to the conversations around me. My mother talked about the number of guests. My father asked about the catering schedule. My sibling complained about clothes that had not been ironed yet. Everything sounded normal, just like in previous years. The difference was that this time, I was truly listening from a distance. I realized that none of them intended to hurt me. They were simply moving along a path that had been formed long ago. A path that was never questioned because I had always followed it. That realization made me calmer but also firmer with myself. As noon approached, the house became more crowded. Some relatives arrived early to help. Laughter filled the living room. I stepped out to greet them briefly, then returned to the kitchen. I carried out my role as usual, but my mind was no longer fully there. In the middle of the busyness, I noticed the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. That date was marked with a small note by my mother, signaling an important day. I stared at it a few seconds longer. There was nothing else added, no other note. I smiled faintly and looked away. I began preparing myself quietly, not with a large bag or a complicated plan. I simply made sure there was enough money in my wallet and that my phone was fully charged. Simple things, but enough to make me feel not trapped. When my mother asked me to check the guest tables again, I did it neatly. I arranged the chairs, straightened the tablecloths, and made sure everything looked good. I wanted to leave the house in order, not out of obligation, but because it was my way of closing a cycle. In all of that, no one asked where I would go later. No one noticed that I was a little quieter than usual. Everyone was too focused on the preparations. I did not feel the need to explain. When lunchtime arrived, we sat together briefly. Short conversations, then everyone moved again. I ate calmly. I enjoyed the taste of the food without rushing. I knew that after this, the atmosphere would become even more crowded. I returned to my room with the excuse of getting something. Inside, I stood still for a moment, regulating my breath. There was no panic, no guilt. Only a small certainty that I had the right to decide how I would live this day. I did not leave a note. I did not give any big sign. I simply prepared myself to step out when the time felt right. I waited for the moment when everyone would be too busy to notice my movement. The voices of guests grew louder. Music started playing. I knew that was the sign the main event would soon begin. I left my room and walked through the living room. Some people greeted me, and I returned their greetings with brief smiles. No one was suspicious. I paused for a moment near the door and looked back into the house. I saw my mother talking to someone, my father busy arranging chairs, and my sibling laughing loudly. The scene felt familiar. For the first time, it did not hurt to see it. I stepped outside without rushing. The air outside felt lighter. I closed the door gently so it would not make a sound. There was no feeling of abandoning responsibility. I had done my part. I walked away from the house with steady steps. Each step felt real. I did not know exactly where I was going, but I knew I did not want to be there when the cake was brought out and the song was sung. I did not want to stand in the corner of the room again. I was not angry. I did not want to prove anything. I simply wanted to live one day in my own way. A day that I had been passing through for years without a choice. I walked without a clear destination. There was no specific place I wanted to reach. I only wanted to put distance between myself and the house, and from the sounds that had always filled that day. My steps were not fast, but they were not hesitant either. I let my feet take me toward whatever felt the calmest. A few minutes later, I reached a quiet spot. There was a long bench by the roadside, surrounded by trees. I sat down and let out a slow breath. For the first time since morning, I truly stopped moving. No one was waiting for my help. No one was calling my name for small tasks. I was alone, and strangely, it felt comfortable. I checked my phone and looked at the time. Time kept moving, just like on any other day. The difference was that this time I did not feel left behind. I turned off the screen and put it away. I wanted to enjoy this moment without distractions. I realized that my decision to leave was not an escape. I was not running from my family. I was not trying to avoid reality. I was simply creating distance so I could hear my own thoughts. For so long, I had given in too easily until I forgot to ask what I actually wanted. I thought about my past birthdays. They all felt like similar fragments of the same scene. A busy house, me helping, then the day ending without a trace. I was never truly present as myself. I was always the supporting role, and I allowed it to happen. Sitting there, I asked myself why I was only doing this now. The answer was simple. Because I was finally tired enough to stop. Because I finally admitted that silence does not always mean maturity. Sometimes, silence only delays the pain. I did not feel guilty about leaving the house before the event began. I had done what needed to be done. I did not ruin anything. I did not disturb anyone. I simply chose not to take part. That choice was simple, yet it gave me a sense of relief I had never felt before. I decided to buy something for myself. Not a big gift, just food that I liked. I walked to the nearest place and ordered calmly. When I sat down and ate, I did not rush. I enjoyed every bite without thinking about time. There were no candles, no song, no loud greetings. But for the first time, I knew that the day belonged to me. I did not need to wait for anyone else to make it official. I could acknowledge it myself. My thoughts drifted back to the house for a moment. I imagined the atmosphere there. The preparations were probably getting more hectic. Maybe they had started looking for me, or maybe they had not noticed my absence at all. I did not want to speculate too much. Whatever was happening, I knew I had made the right decision for myself. I had no intention of making a big statement. I did not want drama. I did not want to force anyone to feel guilty. This decision was not about blaming anyone, but about protecting myself. I had spent too long placing my own needs last. After finishing my meal, I walked again without a fixed direction. I let my thoughts flow. I thought about the future and how I wanted to live my life moving forward. I did not want to keep giving in until I disappeared. I wanted to learn to speak, even if slowly. I wanted to learn to choose, even in simple ways. I knew that this small action would not change everything immediately. My family would not suddenly understand everything. Old patterns would not collapse just because I left for one day. But at least, I had started something within myself. I had stopped waiting. The afternoon slowly shifted toward evening. I sat on another bench and looked around. The world kept moving as usual. People passed by, each with their own concerns. No one knew it was my birthday. No one needed to know. I did not need recognition from strangers. I felt a quiet, honest calm. Not because all my problems were solved, but because I was no longer denying my own feelings. I admitted that I was hurt, and I chose not to stay in a place that kept adding to that wound. I finally checked my phone again. There were several messages, mostly from friends. They wished me a happy birthday in simple ways. I replied to them one by one. This time, I smiled without bitterness. I felt fully present. I did not know how I would return home later. I did not know if there would be questions or silence. I did not prepare any answers. I only knew that when I eventually walked back, I would no longer be the same person I was that morning. As the afternoon moved toward evening, I decided to go home. Not out of obligation, but because I did not want to keep avoiding things. I had given myself enough time to breathe and calm my thoughts. Now I wanted to see what remained after I chose to leave without any explanation. My steps were slower than when I had left the house. There was a different sense of readiness in me. I carried no plan and no defensive lines. I only carried the awareness that whatever their reaction might be, I had already been honest with myself. As I approached the house, music was still audible from a distance. That meant the event was not over yet. I paused briefly by the gate, took a steady breath, then went inside. No one noticed my arrival right away. Everyone was still busy with their own tasks. In the living room, the guests were still gathered. Some were sitting and chatting, others stood laughing. I walked past them calmly. A few people greeted me in passing. I returned small smiles. No one asked where I had been. No one seemed to need to know. I saw my mother near the food table. She looked tired, but satisfied. She was busy arranging plates and answering guest questions. My father stood not far from her, helping with quick gestures. They both looked focused. My presence did not immediately change anything. My younger sibling sat in the middle of the crowd, surrounded by cousins and friends. Laughter came easily, and they seemed to enjoy every moment. I watched from a few steps away. No jealousy surfaced. Only a neutral feeling that I rarely experienced before. I chose an empty chair in the corner of the room. I did not want to draw attention. I also did not want to hide. I just wanted to be there as myself, without any extra role. A few minutes passed. Then my mother turned and saw me. Her gaze lingered slightly longer than usual. She seemed to want to say something, but held back because of the people around her. She only gave a small nod, then returned to attending to the guests. I returned the nod without any strong expression. There was no disappointment. There was no sense of satisfaction either. I had stopped placing my feelings on other people's reactions. Not long after, the cake was brought out. The room grew lively again. Everyone gathered. I stayed in my seat. I did not stand as I had in previous years. I did not help cut or distribute the cake. I chose to be an observer without blaming myself. The birthday song was sung. The candles were lit. All eyes focused on one point. I listened from a distance. The usual ache did not appear. Perhaps because I had already marked the day in my own way earlier. After the song ended and the applause faded, the atmosphere loosened again. People began to move around. I stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen. I did not want to avoid anyone, but I also did not want to stay in the crowd for too long. In the kitchen, I paused and looked at the sink. I realized that normally, I would have immediately started cleaning something. This time, I did not. I simply stood there, then poured myself a glass of water. As I took a sip, my mother entered. She stood beside me without speaking for a few seconds. The silence felt different, not awkward, but not warm either. Finally, she asked softly where I had gone since the afternoon. I answered briefly that I had stepped out for a while. There was no long explanation, no challenging tone. I spoke plainly. My mother nodded. She did not ask further questions. She did not apologize or comment. Maybe she was not ready, or maybe she had not fully realized it yet. I did not try to guess. I had learned not to fill silence with assumptions. We stood side by side for a moment, then my mother returned to the living room. I did not follow her. I stayed in the kitchen until my feelings settled. I did not want that small exchange to turn into something I was not ready to face. Night began to fall. The guests slowly left. The house returned to a calmer rhythm. I helped tidy up a few light things, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. That difference mattered. When I finally went into my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and took off my shoes. My body felt tired, but my mind felt light. I stared at the wall for a moment, then smiled softly for no clear reason. The day did not end with recognition or an apology. There was no dramatic scene, no tears, but something had shifted. I no longer felt invisible, I saw myself with more honesty. That night, the house finally grew quiet. The last guest said goodbye, the door was closed, and the music was turned off. The balloons were still hanging, but the atmosphere had changed. There was no more loud laughter or hurried footsteps. Only the hum of the fan and the soft clinking of dishes from the kitchen remained. I stepped out of my room when I saw my mother and father starting to tidy up the living room. Usually I would join in immediately without being asked. This time, I stopped a few steps away from them. I stood there, waiting for a moment that felt right. My heart was beating faster, but my mind was calm. My father looked up first. He seemed tired, but also relieved that the event had gone well. He asked casually whether I had eaten. I nodded. The question felt ordinary, but it was enough to open space. I took a breath and spoke in an even voice, not raised and not shaking. I said that it was also my birthday. The sentence was short. There was no accusing tone. No excessive emotion. I said it as if stating a simple fact. The room fell silent. My mother stopped moving. My father looked at me without saying anything. The silence did not last long, but it felt heavy. For the first time, I saw their expressions change not because of the event, but because of my words. I did not continue explaining. I did not bring up the past. I did not mention the previous years. I just stood there and waited. I wanted them to process what they had just heard on their own. My mother broke the silence in a soft voice. She asked why I had not said anything earlier. I answered honestly that I had said it before, but it had never been treated as important. My response stayed brief. I did not want the conversation to turn into an argument. My father sighed and sat down on a chair. He looked down for a moment, then met my eyes again. He said he had not realized that I felt that way. The words sounded sincere, but they also revealed how much distance there had been all along. I nodded. I did not feel the need to argue or justify myself. My goal was not to make them feel guilty. I just wanted to stop holding everything in. My mother looked uneasy. She said they had never meant to ignore me. She mentioned being busy old habits and the assumption that I was always fine. I listened without interrupting. I had heard similar explanations many times in different forms. I replied that I understood they were busy. I knew they did not have bad intentions. But I also said that the impact was still the same for me. I did not feel remembered. The sentence came out calmly without a raised voice. My sibling came out of their room and saw us standing in an unusual formation. They asked what was going on. No one answered right away. I turned to them and said that it was also my birthday. I used the same tone as before. Their expression changed. They looked confused, then surprised. They said they did not know. They said they thought we were always celebrated together. I nodded. I believed they were not pretending. I did not blame them. They apologized in an awkward way. Not dramatic, but sincere. They said they had never thought about it from my perspective. The apology did not erase the past, but it was enough to make me feel heard. The conversation did not last long. There were no long hugs or tears. We just stood in the messy living room, talking about something that should have been addressed a long time ago. It did not feel light, but it was not crushing either. After a few minutes, my mother said she would make a warm drink. My father began taking down the remaining decorations. My sibling returned to their room with a calmer expression. I stood alone for a moment, processing everything. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel satisfied either, but I felt honest. I had finally said what I had been hiding without exploding or hurting anyone. That was enough for me. When I returned to my room, my body felt tired, but my chest felt lighter. I sat on the bed and looked at my phone. A few more messages had come in from friends. I replied to them one by one, without rushing. I knew that one conversation would not change everything overnight. Habits do not collapse in a single night. But at least I had stopped the cycle of silence. One had set a clear boundary. The morning after that night felt different, even though the house looked the same. Balloons were still hanging, some decorations had not been taken down, and the smell of yesterday's food still lingered. Yet the atmosphere was no longer filled with activity. Everyone moved more slowly, as if being careful not to disturb something that had just formed. I woke up and left my room as usual. My mother was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She glanced up when I entered. The look was brief, but there was something in it that had never been there before. It was not overwhelming guilt, nor a defensive attitude. It was more like awareness that was still being processed. She greeted me and asked if I had slept well. The question was simple, but it felt different because it was rarely directed straight at me. I answered briefly and sat at the table. There was no awkward silence, just light conversation about the day ahead. My father appeared a few minutes later. He seemed quieter than usual. He poured himself some coffee and sat down without much to say. Occasionally, he glanced in my direction, then returned his gaze to his cup. I did not feel the need to start a conversation. I had already said what needed to be said. My sibling came out last. They looked hesitant, as if unsure how to act. They greeted me in a softer tone and asked if I had eaten. I answered calmly. The exchange was short, but it showed that they were making an effort. There was no revisiting of what had happened the night before. No long explanations, no promises spoken out loud. Yet the quiet of that morning carried meaning. Everyone seemed aware that something had shifted, even if no one yet knew what it would become. The day went on like any other. I got ready to head out and continue my activities. Before I left, my mother called me over and told me to be careful. She added one small sentence she rarely said, that she hoped I would have a good day. I nodded and thanked her. Outside the house, I walked with a steady feeling. I was not euphoric, but I was not weighed down either. I thought about the conversation from the night before without strong emotion. I knew it would not fix everything right away. But I also knew that silence was no longer my only option. As I went through my day, I focused more on what I was doing. I did not dwell too much on home. I allowed myself space to keep moving forward without waiting for further reactions. That was part of the change I wanted to protect. In the afternoon, I returned home as usual. The house looked tidier. Some of the decorations had been taken down. My mother was folding clothes, my father was sitting and reading, and my sibling was in their room. I put my things away and joined them in the living room. There were no heavy conversations. We simply shared the space. Later, my mother called me into the kitchen. She said she wanted to talk for a moment. Her voice was calm. She said she had been thinking about what I told them the night before. She admitted that they were used to assuming I was always fine. She said they had never intended to make me feel overlooked. I listened without interrupting. I had learned that not every acknowledgement needed an immediate response. When she finished, I nodded. I said I was not demanding anything, but I wanted to be more included and remembered. The words came out without weight. My mother nodded slowly. She did not promise any big changes. She simply said she would try to pay more attention. For some people, that might sound small. For me, it was enough for now. That evening we ate together. The mood was calm. There was no talk about the party or birthdays. Still, the conversation felt more balanced. When I spoke, no one cut me off. When I was quiet, the topic did not immediately shift away. I realized that change does not always arrive in big gestures. Sometimes it appears in the way people listen. In simple questions, in pauses before speaking. Small things that were not there before. I also understood that my work did not end with one moment of courage. I needed to keep protecting the boundaries I had set. I could not return to old habits just because things felt more comfortable. I needed to stay honest, even in a calm way. That night when I returned to my room, I felt more whole. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer disappearing from my own life story. I had taken my place even if slowly. Several days passed after that conversation, and I began to notice small patterns that had never existed before. They were not obvious, but they were felt. My mother asked more often about my daily activities, not just out of politeness. My father occasionally stayed longer in the living room when I was around, as if leaving space in case I wanted to talk. Not every moment felt comfortable, but there was a clear effort. I did not respond to these changes with excessive enthusiasm. I chose to act naturally. I knew that if I expected too much, I would only be disappointed again. So I went on with my days at the same pace, observing without judgment. One afternoon, my mother asked me to accompany her to buy household supplies. Usually that task was given to my sibling. I hesitated for a moment, but then agreed. On the way, our conversation was light. We talked about simple things, like prices and dinner plans. But in the middle of it, my mother asked about my job and whether I enjoyed it. She had never asked that before. I answered honestly, without going into too much detail. I said there were days I enjoyed and days that were exhausting. My mother listened without interrupting. She did not offer unsolicited advice. It was a small thing, but it mattered. When we returned home, I realized the conversation had not weighed me down. I did not feel the need to prove anything. I was simply being myself, and that was enough. On the other hand, my sibling also began to act differently. They no longer treated my presence as background. Several times, they talked to me, asking my opinion about trivial things. They even asked for my help with a personal matter. I realized they were learning to see me not just as the older sibling who was always there, but as an individual. Our relationship had not completely changed. There was still distance shaped by old habits. But at least now, that distance was visible and acknowledged, not ignored. One night, my father knocked on my bedroom door. He rarely did that. He came in and sat on the chair without saying much. A few seconds passed before he said that he was proud of me. The words came out stiffly, but they were sincere. He said he did not always know how to show care. He was used to focusing on results and achievements. He thought that as long as our needs were met, everything was fine. Only recently had he realized that presence also mattered. I listened calmly. I did not feel the need to respond with a long confession. I simply said that I appreciated his honesty. The conversation was brief, but it was enough to clarify many things that had been left hanging for years. After my father left, I sat on my bed for a long time. I thought about how long I had waited for a moment like that. Yet when it finally happened, I did not feel overwhelmed by emotion. I felt steady. I was no longer tying my happiness to other people's validation. I began to realize that the biggest change was not happening within my family, but within myself. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I started choosing myself first. I dared to say no when necessary. I no longer forced myself to be present in spaces that did not value my presence. On several occasions, I declined family events I did not want to attend. In the past, I would have gone just to keep the peace. Now, I was more honest about my boundaries. Strangely, no major conflict followed. They accepted my decision without many questions. That made me realize that my fears had often been much bigger than reality. I had spent too long believing that honesty would destroy relationships. In truth, it was prolonged silence that did the damage. That night, I opened my phone and looked at the date on the calendar. My birthday had passed, but it did not feel completely over. Not because there was a belated celebration, but because I had finally given that day my own meaning. I did not need an extra cake or long birthday wishes. I just needed to feel whole. I needed to know that my voice existed and deserved to be heard. And most importantly, I needed to listen to myself. I do not know how this story will end. But for the first time, I'm not afraid to continue it. I have stopped making myself smaller. I am standing where I am meant to be. And that gives me a strength I never had before. The days that followed moved at a calmer rhythm. There were no major events to mark the change. There were no belated celebrations or special surprises made for me. Yet that was exactly where I began to feel stronger. I no longer waited for something to happen in order to feel that I mattered. I returned my focus to my own life. I managed my time more consciously. I chose activities I genuinely wanted to do. I no longer felt guilty for choosing rest or declining requests that made me uncomfortable. Those small decisions created a healthy distance that I had never had before. At home, the atmosphere remained simple. My family did not suddenly become warm. They were still the same, with their own habits and shortcomings. But now there was clearer space. When I spoke, they listened. When I was silent, they did not treat me as if I did not exist. I also learned not to measure my worth through other people's attention. In the past, I waited to be remembered in order to feel important. Now I know that remembering myself matters far more. I no longer erase my own needs just to preserve other people's comfort. One night I sat alone on the front porch. The air was calm, with no distracting sounds. I thought about the journey I had been through. Years of feeling small, unseen, and used to holding everything in. None of it disappeared instantly, but it no longer controlled how I saw myself. I realized that the courage I showed was not the courage to fight, but the courage to be honest. I did not respond to treatment with anger. I did not demand drastic change. I simply expressed what I felt, then chose to stand steady afterward. My relationship with my family now sits at a more realistic point, not perfect, but more honest. I am no longer playing the role of the one who always gives in. I am present as myself, with a clear voice and clear boundaries. My siblings still act the way they used to at times. But now I no longer interpret it as rejection. I see it as a process. They are learning too, just like me. We share space without needing to dominate each other. My mother remains busy with her routines. My father stays quiet in his own way. But I no longer feel the need to enter their world at the cost of myself. I stand in my own place, and that is enough. I began to celebrate small things in my own way. A cup of my favorite drink after a long day, quiet time without interruptions. Short, honest conversations. Those things give me a satisfaction I never received from other people's validation. When I look back, I no longer feel sad for my past self. I feel proud. They survived this far in their own way. Now my task is to protect the new version of myself, not judge the old one. This story does not end with everyone changing. It ends with one person who stopped making herself smaller. I stopped waiting, stopped hoping in silence, and began acting with calm intention. I know life will continue to present situations that require me to choose, but now I have a clear foundation. I know what I deserve. I know when to speak and when to walk away. If one day I am forgotten again, I will not collapse. I will remember myself. I will remain standing because my existence no longer depends on anyone's recognition. I am Alia, and for the first time, I no longer feel the need to fight to be remembered. I am already enough, even before anyone else realizes it.